And in fact, experience only makes sense if you are embodied, if you can sorrow over the past, if you can evaluate your behavior morally, if you can imagine completely new things which are not just randomly different from what we now believe. Our creativity is not random. It is a special gift whereby something we sense and we reach out to it and it reaches to us. This is not something replicable by a machine.
Okay, I'm delighted to welcome you to this session on consciousness and AI. For those of you who haven't met me, I'm Nigel Warburton. We've got a world-class panel, and I don't know if you remember in 2022 the Google engineer Blake Lemoine who declared that the chatbot he was working on was sentient. At the time, everybody thought he was, well, not everybody, but a lot of people thought he was crazy, but that doesn't prove he was wrong. Now, 2 years later, roughly, things have moved on quite a lot, and a few weeks ago, Anil was in conversation with Dave Chalmers, and he was saying, oh, I can imagine in 10 years' time, a chatbot could be sentient, genuinely sentient, not just mimicking. You know, we talk of stochastic parrots. They are very convincing at persuading us that we're interacting with a human being when we do it at a distance, and they might pass the Turing test for 5 minutes, but very few people at the moment think of them as genuinely conscious. But is it possible that in the future they will be conscious? At least one major philosopher thinks so. Possibly people on the panel think so. But stochastic parrots are dead, bereft of life. And that seems to be an important factor in a lot of people's thinking. So we're going to begin with Carissa Véliz, who I'm sure you know is the author of Privacy is Power. She's also a professor at Oxford University, where she's part of the Institute for Ethics and AI. So, Carissa, 5 minutes.
Thank you. It's great to be here. So, let me start with a story. My great-grandmother was a very beautiful, a very polite, and a very vain woman. And every day, when 6 o'clock came around and it was news time, she would dress up, she would sit in front of the TV, and when the TV man said, "Good afternoon," she would say, "Good afternoon." And of course, her kids were pretty adamant in teaching her that this was inappropriate. And there was one in particular who was quite tech-savvy who explained to her in detail the workings of like TV signals and how TVs receive information but don't actually send out information. And then she could say, like, "Did you understand that?" And she would say, "Yes, I understand." They would question her. She would answer in appropriate ways. And then come 6 o'clock, she would dress up. And then her kids would say, like, "I thought you understood. Why are you dressed up?" And the answer was, "Don't embarrass me in front of the polite TV man." And you might dismiss this old lady as someone who is clueless. But I want to suggest that there was something else going on there that might make us all vulnerable to thinking that something like an AI is conscious, when in fact it's not. So picture yourself, I don't know, 2,000 years ago, and you're in the middle of the jungle, and you're looking for a very kind of exotic fruit that your partner has a craving on. And suddenly, you hear some rustling, and you turn to a bush, and you can see the leaves moving in a pattern. And you have two options. Option number one is to hope it's the wind. Option number two is to run for your life. Now, if you run for your life, assuming there might be a jaguar there or something like that, it has some costs. You will expend energy, and your heart will skip a bit or two. But if you don't assume that there's a creature there, and you just hope for the best, that might be a lot more costly. Your partner will not get that fruit. And so in some cognitive science circles, some people call this hyperactive agency detection. But basically, we have a really useful heuristic that is, when in doubt, assume there's a mind. Because assuming there's not a mind can be quite dangerous. And I want to suggest that it's this that makes us fall into certain kinds of confusion. So when I read about Le Bon, this Google engineer who said that this large language model was sentient, and when I read his statements, what I saw was a categorical mistake. So essentially, we tend to think that language is correlated with intelligence and sentience, and for the most part it is, but of course there are people who cannot talk, but can feel like in locked-in syndrome, and the reverse is also true. We can have language, and there's nothing there behind it. And so to go back to Anil's comment and Thomas Nagel's phrase, there's nothing it's like for an AI to be an AI. And there isn't the allure of pleasure or the harshness of pain. An AI is not cold, it's not hot, it's not impatient, it's not lonely. I want to suggest that why we make this mistake is we are building AIs to act as if they were conscious. And this is very morally problematic, because I want to suggest that we are building these systems to be misleading by design. We're teaching them to speak like a human being. But when I ask a large language model, do you like apples? And the large language model says, yes, I love apples. They're super sweet and crunchy. It's not because it's tasted an apple. It cannot even taste anything. It's because it has done this statistical analysis of thousands of texts that say that apples are crunchy and tasty. And in the same way, when it kind of uses an emoji, it's hijacking your emotional responses and your empathic responses, but there's no one there smiling behind the screen. And what we're doing is like we are creating this mirror, and then it's like if this morning when you were getting ready, you were wondering like what that twin on the other side of the mirror is going to do for the rest of the day. Not much. But because our large language models are more kind of mysterious to us, we tend to ascribe this. So I tend to think like Anil that consciousness is something inextricably intertwined with life, and that it is related to biology and to chemistry. But let's say I'm wrong. Let's say that the mind is more computational. You can imagine somebody completely different to me, like, I don't know, my nemesis, arguing now that we will have these AIs, and they are conscious, and we risk having, violating their rights and so on and so forth. Let's say I'm wrong. I want to call attention to the ethics of this. What are we doing? If we really think that's where we're going, what in the world are we doing? And you have these tech people who tell you two things. On the one hand, they tell you how dangerous this is and that we're going to catastrophe, and they're putting all their money and effort in building it. And recently, Jeff Hinton gave a talk at Oxford, and he said essentially the same thing. This is very dangerous. We're doing something super reckless. I left Google because I'm worried about it, even though I still hold stock on it on Google. And then in the Q&A, I asked him, if you were to go back, would you do it again? Oh, yeah, I would do everything the same way as I did. So something doesn't check out. If we are trying to build this thing, why are we doing it? And is the right thing? And then final comment, this is a very, very old story from like Talos, the first robot or automaton of some sort, to Pygmalion falling in love with his creation. This is a very, very old tale that we are, and we should just kind of ask ourselves, why are we doing this? And is this the right thing to do?
So, there's nothing that it's like to be a bot, and if there is, we're in trouble. Brian, who is unique amongst us in having worked a lot with AI and is CEO of a company that's Scope 3, which is involved in working out the ecological implications of certain uses of AI, and so you must be working with AI every day and might have a different view of this.
Well, just as an oracle. So I think we all agree that AI is not conscious. I think we have broad consensus that only biological entities are embodied and capable of permitting, transmitting, or emitting consciousness. But we also asked yesterday, what if we're wrong? How might we be wrong? And what are the ethical consequences of being wrong? And so I think, Simon, you made the great point that we have to personalize these complex topics. And unlike you, I grew up with a father who gave me a legacy of Tom Swift novels, of Roger Zelazny and Ursula Guin and Asimov and Neil Stephenson, who just asked this question, what if? I mean, science fiction gives this amazing connection to a world that might not be, but could be. So how might we be wrong? What if we're confusing the lack of progress with the lack of potential? That yes, large language models are pretty dumb and just perhaps stochastic parrots today, but if you follow the money, $40 billion a year invested by big tech into AI research, if you follow where these researchers are taking AI, it's not linear. We're investing in all kinds of different paths of AI that I don't think look anything like what we see today. And I certainly agree that this may be the Mines of Moria or the Tower of Babel. These people could be the modern Oppenheimer or Frankenstein. But guess what? The modern Frankenstein's name is Bezos. Maybe it's Musk. I'm not really sure. But we have zero power to stop them taking their personal power and money and investing it in these technologies. So we might be wrong because we can't stop an immense amount of investment into these new technologies. I heard a few things that I thought were perhaps incorrect. This idea that AI isn't embodied. At Carnegie Mellon, there's research going on to basically take AI models and put them into robots. And not to program them on words, but to program them simply with the images and sounds and sensations when they experience a real environment. We are teaching them to learn like toddlers walking around. And if you watch how long it takes a toddler to figure out how to walk, it's a long time. And these are different ways of training on foundational concepts that are not simply words and numbers. I heard this idea that AI isn't alive. It doesn't replicate or mutate. But that's also not true. What we're seeing is that AI is being trained on data generated by AI. We're seeing AIs that are being structured based on AI. We actually can't build AIs without the help of AI. We can't program AIs without the help of AI. And it would take very little effort or imagination to see AIs beginning to replicate in evolutionary ways. And this also implies an AI can die. So I'm not sure we're that far from the idea that the characteristics of life, this idea of survival, of, I don't know about sex, but certainly this quest not to die, could be given to an AI. So I want to be careful that we're not confusing where we are now to where we might be. And I'm not saying anything about BatGPT because I haven't researched it, but that could be pretty cool. So I guess my question really is, imagining we're wrong, the ethical implications of the idea of using AI reminds me of many of the points we got from this indigenous conversation. Are we colonial when we refer to this new species we might be bringing about? Are we actually, instead of using AI, supposed to revere AI? Is our purpose here to possess this new technology or to befriend this new technology? I'm not sure. Should we nurture it like a child or interact with it like a friend? Or maybe this is that bottle washing up on the beach that's going to kill our birth rates, because we fall in love with something inanimate with which we can't reproduce. I'm just saying all of these seem very plausible to me. And so before we belittle the idea that AI might be conscious, let's not take the position that it can't be. Because what if it can, and are we ready? And I'll just say that we should have awed humility about this idea that we might bring new life into the world. And for the species we inhabit, I don't mean A-W-E-D, I mean O-D-D. Because I think you're right. In our history, as humanity, we make dumb, terrible mistakes all the time. We regret our creations and we would do it again. Could we for once be humble in the presence of something possibly greater than ourselves?
Thank you. So really we need to imagine what is possible, not just look at the past of AI, which is a very short past, and most of the people commentating are kind of ignorant about the speed with which things are moving and the details of how that is not linear progress, but is really going to go in a very steep curve very quickly.
Or not.
Or not. Thank you. So Iain McGilchrist, who I'm sure you all know is a polymath and so equipped to talk about many dimensions of this topic.
Well, I think I better do that, hadn't I? Both speakers have referred obliquely to the precautionary principle, and that seems to be something that we seem to be neglecting. And the precautionary principle is simply that if there's a non-negligible chance of something developing into a catastrophic outcome, you should be careful of embracing it. And we're clearly not operating according to that principle. Quite apart from the various things that have been referred to, I think there are problems. I'll just say them very briefly because I need to get on to the question about consciousness. But I'm very worried about the impact on human society of the shedding of real human beings from jobs and their replacement by machines, the cynical disregard for ordinary human beings that's displayed by companies that do this, because they know that your life and my life will be significantly impoverished by having to spend hours and hours on a dumb machine every day in order to do something that used to be done by speaking to a real person for 5 minutes. I'm worried about the potential for total control, obviously. I'm worried about the self-referential nature of the system, so that if ChatGPT does a trolley dash around the internet to answer a question, a lot of the material it's picking up off the shelves is stuff that was put there by AI in the first place. And this precludes the possibility of being open to things. We get more and more close into what we're already doing, what we know. That is a significant impoverishment. There is also a very significant impoverishment of our understanding of ourselves. The very fact that we now liken ourselves to computers. People talk about uploading things and their data banks of memory and so on. These are false and treacherous metaphors. Memory is a very important and misunderstood. I mean, I'm not claiming I understand it, but it is a much more mysterious phenomenon than we think. It's not just having data to refer to. That would be like going to a library, taking a book down and finding out the answer. But memory is something that is thread through the whole of a life and governs the way in which we respond to things. And it is not possible to reduce it to segments. This is a very significant difference. Our consciousness is a flow. I didn't have time to talk in my opening talk about this very important difference, which is really the difference between Bergson's idea of temps, instants, moments, the clock, and durée, which is rather like a melody, something that unfolds, that has meaning all through it. And I think there's a good chance that we will think that we understand the spiritual in a new way, which will encourage us to misunderstand even more than we do already what a spiritual life is. It's not about propositions. It's not about ideas. It's about something that actually is deep in our being and is nourished by the fact that we suffer and that we know we're going to die, that we do have bodies, and with all respect, I don't think that you can teach the machine through sensations. You implied that it could have the sort of sensations that we have, but I don't know how that would come about. I don't think anyone would know how that could come about. And in fact, experience only makes sense if you are embodied, if you can sorrow over the past, if you can evaluate your behavior morally, if you can imagine completely new things which are not just randomly different from what we now believe. Our creativity is not random. It is a special gift whereby something we sense and we reach out to it and it reaches to us. This is not something replicable by a machine in my submission. And to come, because I know we've got not much time, but just to talk about hemispheres here, I put up some lists of how the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere tend to prioritize different aspects of reality. And if you look at the list on the right side, which was the right hemisphere, you immediately see a problem for a machine. The right hemisphere understands what is new, what is not just based on what is familiar. It understands the possible, not just certainties. It can work with only possibilities, with nothing at all that is certain. I'm not sure, but I've been told by people in IT, and I'll probably be corrected, that no computer can actually work from no certainties at all and build up a coherent picture. There's the matter of the flow, which I've mentioned. There's the matter of understanding that a whole is quite different from the sum of its parts, largely because of the way it enters into human experience. The importance of the implicit, which is the stuff that is never mentioned, never dated, never stuck into a memory bank, but is actually something we sense between one another by the process of living as frail human beings that are mortal. The importance of context, the context of context of context. Everything is context. Uniqueness. How does a machine understand something that is unique for its uniqueness? It's based on generalities. The need for the take on quality, not just quantity, on animacy, on the presence of something. And what a computer is doing is, by definition, representing something. Initially, it's imitating something. It is parasitic on us, and it does what it does because clever people made it look as though it were doing things that we do. But that is a representation. And this fundamental difference between something that presences and something is represented is central to consciousness, central to creativity, and central to life.
Thank you. So we need to remain with human beings, and in your view, it seems there's nothing that AI can deliver that is the equivalent of the things that we value as human beings.
I mean, it can rationalize and faster than we can, and I don't dispute that. So it can add certain things. It can work through enormous amounts of data far faster than we can. That's fine, but it can't simulate what it is to be a human. And if it tries to, we'll get the wrong message about what being a human is.
Thank you. So now to Anil Seth, who's a neuroscientist, as we know, and author of Being You. He's also written and spoken a lot on this topic recently. I think you've become the sort of go-to neuroscientist on this in some sense. So what's your view?
Thanks, Nigel. I'm going to use 30 seconds of my precious 5 minutes. It was said we all agree AI is not conscious. What's the sense in the room? Hands up if you think GPT 4, 5, 6 will feel stuff as well as speak. How many think AI is or could be conscious? This is quite surprising. It's like, so there's no...
Could be asked the same about plants.
What?
Could be asked the same about plants, because it could be asked the same about plants.
That's exactly what I was going to say, because a lot of what we've heard over the last couple of days is a kind of a liberality with attributing consciousness to things. But no one here is willing to attribute it to a language model or to AI. I wonder why, or very few. We humans have a pretty crap track record of withholding moral considerability from things that we later realize deserve it. Many non-human animals, many other humans over history. Are we making the same mistake again with computers, with language models, and so on? I don't think we are, and I think we need to be very careful about this. What I would suggest in the next few minutes is that we are more similar to language models and other forms of AI in ways that do not matter for moral considerability and consciousness. And we are less similar to them in ways that do matter. And unless we see that clearly, we'll end up caring for things that it doesn't really make a difference to those things, because there is nothing it is like to be a bot, and caring less about things that really do deserve our moral considerability. Why would we even think that AI is conscious? I mean, partly it's in the word. AI is a terrible name, artificial intelligence. Everyone likes it, but really when you talk to people who do AI, they do machine learning. And when you talk to people who do machine learning, really they're doing applied statistics. Who thinks applied statistics is conscious? Not many people. It's partly a branding problem. Then we have our psychological biases. We're so subject to, and this came up in Carissa's beautiful story, we're so subject to both anthropomorphism, projecting human values onto things on the basis of superficial similarities, and also anthropocentrism, the tendency to see the world through human values and with a human lens. And then there's human exceptionalism. We still put ourselves on top of the pile. And language, we feel, is one thing that makes us special. That's why language models have seduced our intuitions. rather than things like AlphaGo, which DeepMinded that plays Go, or the other forms of AI that actually do really useful things, like find new potential medicines and so on. It's all AI, but we only really worry about language models because they speak to us, and we think that's the kind of similarity that matters, but it doesn't. You combine all of these three assumptions together, it's no surprise that people like Blakely Mohan got suckered in, and others of us do too. It's very hard not to be. There's also a deeper reason, a deeper problem and a deeper assumption, which is consciousness the kind of thing a computer could even have? Whether it's a language model, or if we, as some people in my field do, we try to take our theories of consciousness and run them on a computer. It doesn't have to be assumed that it's going to come along for free as AI gets smarter. Intelligence and consciousness are not the same things. Another conflation we make because of our human bias. But could a computer even in principle be conscious? Here, I think we overestimate what we mean when we think of the brain as a kind of computer. It's and this came out a couple of days ago, yesterday. It's very easy, you hear it all the time, brains do information processing, brain is a kind of computer, computers can simulate anything, so why not? Could a computer, if you program it the right way, would be conscious? We're made of stuff, computers are made of stuff, so why not? But not everything is a computer. Sure, you might be able to use a computer to simulate everything. That does not mean that simulation is instantiation. Nobody gets confused about the fact that if you run a simulation of a weather system, it does not get wet or windy. Nobody expects a computer simulation of a black hole to actually engulf the galaxy. We know there's a difference between simulation and instantiation. Why do people assume that consciousness is different, that simulation will be enough to give rise to it? For some things it's true. Computer that plays chess, or actually plays the history of chess, but it plays chess. But a computer simulation of consciousness, it might be, but one cannot assume that it is. And the more you look into it, the more you uncover the ways in which bodies are different from computers. And Iain, you beautifully articulated some of those differences. At root, a computer is something which, by design, what it does is separable from what it is. That's why computers are useful. You can run Word on it. You can run any program you want. You can take the same program and run it on different computers, and it'll do the same thing. Computers would be pretty crap if these things weren't true. That's true by design. Brains are not kinds of things like that. Evolution didn't care about running what's happening in my brain on somebody else's brain. Brains, it's not just, there's no sharp division between the mindware and the wetware as there is between the hardware and the software in a computer. You can't separate in a brain what it does from what it is, and what it is something very different at heart from a computer. It's actually not alive at all, I don't think. Well, computers are not alive, brains fundamentally are. Finish with just the ethics, one point on the ethics. We can't help being mistaken about this, and this really matters, because if we design systems to give the appearance of being conscious, there's no good way out of this. Either we care about them even though we know they're not conscious or believe they're not conscious, in which case we waste some of our moral considerability on lifeless, feelingless hunks of silicon and code. And we care less about other things. We really care about GPT-4. Or we learn to not care about them even though we still feel they are conscious. And there's back to Kant, this brutalizes our psychology. It's why we don't rip up dolls in front of children. If we treat things as if they don't feel, when we feel that they feel, this is just very unhealthy for us, and that puts us in a double bind. So back to your point, we should not be just obliviously treating this as a goal. The number of times I hear that it's really cool to build artificial consciousness, it is absolutely not cool. It is a really bad idea. And Frankenstein, the real Promethean sin of Frankenstein, was not creating life, it was creating an entity that was conscious. That's what led to all the carnage that followed. Let's not make the same mistake, either in reality or in appearance.
Thank you, thank you. What a great panel. You can see we've got a world-class panel here. Just to summarize, my view of what you said was something like simulations don't necessarily reproduce everything they simulate, but also you might be able to separate the moral questions that we currently attach to consciousness. If you have a a machine that is conscious. It's still a further question. It's still an open question as to whether or not that consciousness is of a kind which gives it moral rights. Yeah?
Yeah, there's a debate about narrow and broad sentientism here. So even if a system is conscious, one can argue that unless it has the capacity to experience valenced forms of consciousness, things feel good or bad in some sense, then it's not within the circle of moral considerability. Broader things, say anything that has any kind of consciousness is within the circle.
Thank you. So I'll ask you each a quick question, and then we'll open it up to the floor for questions, okay? Short questions. Carissa, you're brilliant at analysing the dangers of certain uses of the internet and so on in the area of privacy. What do you see as the real dangers associated with AI? What's the worst scenario?
There are so many dangers, and something that's very important is that those dangers can come way before any AI is conscious, intelligent, or sentient. And these three things are not the same thing, but we can, human beings are pretty good at killing one another. Tech can enhance that, and it can enhance that in very effective ways before it's conscious, intelligent, or sentient. And of course, we have the problem of jobs, but the problem I worry more about is that I don't think it's a coincidence that democracy is struggling at the same time that digital tech is on the rise. It is not a coincidence, and there are two reasons for this. One, code tends to be very authoritarian. If your car says this is the speed limit and it's coded in, there's no leeway, there's no emergency, there's no negotiation, there's no paying a fine. Code rules. And who is making the rules of that code? It's not your political representative, it's a couple of white guys in Silicon Valley. The second reason why AI is very dangerous to democracy is surveillance. The kinds of AI that we're building at the moment needs troves and troves of data. Much of that data is personal data, and personal data is dangerous. When the citizenry doesn't have the power over that personal data, companies and governments, or either both, have too much power. And importantly, and I think this kind of complements both Brian's comment and Anil's comment, no technology is predetermined. Technology is by design. We are designing these things, and we get to design it the way we want to. And so when a tech person says, like, oh, this is going to happen anyway, like, it's inevitable, I think we should challenge that. And yes, we should think about whether it's possible to have consciousness in AI in the future. Of course, we should think about it. But more importantly, we should think, like, should we design these things in this manner, from like them being super misleading in the way they express themselves and kind of mimicking consciousness and sentience, to actually trying for those not only to mimic, but to be the real thing.
Thank you. So Brian, I've got a question for you. What would it take for you to say that AI has consciousness? What sort of phenomena would it have to display to get to the what-if point of saying, yeah, okay, we're really dealing with something that's conscious now?
I mean, that's just so far above my pay grade. I have no idea. I'm not sure we would recognize consciousness in a digital system any more than we would recognize consciousness in a plant. And I think the idea that these are computers, or that code is fixed or deterministic, I think is actually not the way this is evolving. What we're seeing is, when I was a freshman in computer science at Princeton, I asked if I could study AI, and they said no. AI is a dead field. We've figured out all there is to know about artificial intelligence. There's nothing left to study. And so I was told to do something practical. But there was one rule we couldn't cross in computer science. You can't write code that modifies code. And in fact, computers, as we think of them today, are dualistic. You have instructions and you have data. Mind and matter. Never the twain shall meet. AI is changing the way we think about code in ways that I think fundamentally change the way we think about computers, from being deterministic and computational to being actually self-modifying and random, like life. And that is what I'm concerned about, is that that consciousness may not actually appear in the way that we consider ourselves to be individual. Computers are off in the cloud somewhere. That means big warehouses full of servers. They might also be in our phones. When is our phone conscious? Is a different way of asking that. It's not when is AI conscious. It's when is our phone actually reaching some perspective of life, consciousness, realization, self-realization. I don't have any idea how we know, but I think it's possible.
Thank you. Now, I remember reading R.G. Collingwood, the Oxford philosopher, and be quite shocked by how outraged he was about radio and the effect of radio on the kind of culture of intelligent Britain. And now, obviously, many people think of radio as a highly intellectual medium in contrast with things around it. Are you sure that some of your concerns about the risks of AI and attributing consciousness to AI aren't of that nature, that sort of you've grown up in a culture which values certain things, and we're in flux. Things are changing dramatically quickly. And is it more a case that perhaps that we all need to learn to think differently about what we now value and see potential and not just risk?
And what you're saying is I'm a stick in the mud, basically.
No, I'm just asking. No, what would you say to somebody who said that? Because I mean, I can see, like, if you went to Silicon Valley and said what you said,
yeah.
I'm sure people would be very polite. But then they're going to think, well, he's in the past, and this is the future.
Well, yes, but that doesn't absolve us of making judgments of better and worse. And of course, things can get better, or they can get worse, and usually do in different respects. So there's certainly an argument, I don't know about radio, which you call an intellectual medium, which it used to be about 20 years ago before the BBC became completely...
I'm thinking about podcasts now.
...crashed. But there's an argument that television actually had an effect, a non-desirable effect on family life and social life and so on. So these people were not always stupid. In fact, I think a lot of people were prescient. But when it comes to AI, I think the number of things we can already see are happening that are damaging or deleterious, I believe, and the ways in which that is changing human beings, the way they talk, behave, and think and expect of one another. I can see this happening. And you will say, well, yes, it's just happening. I mean, this is the future. But we should be able to have a choice about the future. And if there is no choice about the future, then there's no point in us sitting here and discussing it. We're talking about it.
Do you think I mean, that would rule out a lot of philosophy. There are many things that philosophers talk about over which they have no control. And I still think it's important that philosophy should have a space to discuss what is happening to us. Look, I can't control whether Trump gets elected or not, but I have very strong views about the implications and what it means for America if he is.
That's really what I'm saying, that just because it may be what's happening, it doesn't mean I'm absolved from having an opinion about whether it's good or bad.
Oh, sorry, yeah. Thank you. Anil, you've spoken a lot about the kind of fleshiness of the brain in the sense that it's part of a body and there's a lot more going on than just there's computation. Could you elaborate a bit on that and how that might play out in this argument? What is it about the physiology of human beings and the consciousness that we know that is associated with human beings that makes you more skeptical than some of your peers about the possibility of AI being conscious?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to say that in neuroscience and in consciousness research, the default assumption is this thing called computational functionalism, which is the idea that computation of some sort is sufficient for consciousness. Now, this is beginning to become challenged just a little bit now. At the last meeting I was at in Tokyo a couple of weeks ago, we had a symposium about it. It's a bit of chat, but it's still a dominant position. But so what's special about life? It seems to be a bit of a, maybe just a brute claim, like almost vitalistic, like life is magic. And I don't mean that at all. There are many things about life that are important for consciousness, potentially important for consciousness, that don't involve any kind of neo-vitalism. And I think that first, it's an open question, so it may be wrong, and also life, there are many different kinds of ways of things that could be living. A key thing about a living system is that it produces its own components. There's this property that's been called autopoiesis for those people in the more inactive field. Very different kind of thing, not only from an AI, but from basically anything we make in technology at all. Completely different kind of thing. And why might that be relevant? Well, then the intuition for me is that if we look at the mechanisms in the brain that strongly associated with how we perceive things, how we consciously experience things, and sometimes unconsciously experience things. There's a direct through line you can see to how the brain is regulating, controlling the body, and that through line reaches down even into individual cells. A single cell is keeping itself going in a way that is it's a very direct parallel between a cell regenerating its components, minimizing unexpected states for that cell, and how the brain minimizes unexpected sensory signals in the act of perception. Now, that's just a very broad brush, but it hints at the idea that even if consciousness is a function of what brains do, and that doesn't have to be just computation, it can just be general property of the dynamics or whatever, that you can still only instantiate those kinds of dynamics in systems that are alive. And there's an explanatory sort of through line from phenomenology of the experience to basic mechanisms of life. But it is a hypothesis. I don't think it's evidently true.
So, does anybody on the panel feel urgently that they need to say something more on topics that have come up? Just put your hand up now and I'll take you in order, like Carissa first and then Anil.
I'd like to say another hypothesis that is compatible with yours. And again, it's more of a hypothesis than an argument. So I wrote this paper called Moral Zombies, in which I argue that what we're doing with AI is like we're building moral zombies because they mimic moral behavior without being moral agents. And I argue that to be a moral agent, you have to have the understanding of what it means to inflict pain on someone. And you can't possibly have moral understanding unless you know yourself what it's like to be in pain. And I think, even more important than the kind of replicating your own components, because I think, as Brian said, AI could do that. It could reprogram itself and kind of even mine the own kind of components to kind of build itself as a robot or whatever. Or you could imagine it. There's this kind of very primary correlation between phenomenology and functions, that to be hungry is a kind of engine. And of course, computer scientists might say, well, but we build rewards into the system, right? But I think that's a stretch from the kind of hunger we feel when we actually feel hungry or thirsty. When a kind of, even a cell is drawn towards glucose.
So living systems have skin in the game in a way that even a computer, given goals, doesn't. And actually, one of the things motivating this idea that computers could be conscious is this idea, well, you could just, you could replace every neuron by a silicon chip, and if you replace them all, then why would that thing not still be conscious? Yeah. And that's just one of these conceivability arguments in philosophy that I really dislike, because it's asking you to believe something that's really not evidently possible at all nomologically. The thing I wanted to comment on, though, was very briefly, was on the ethics thing, and you were mentioning the fact that very bad things can happen with AI, amplifying our tendencies to be human tendencies. And this, I think, is the really important thing about the current discussion, because a lot of the discussion about the implications of AI ethics gets hijacked by these kinds of Terminator scenarios, like, what if AI becomes conscious and takes over the world? And
it's a distraction.
And it's a distraction from the clear and present ethical dangers now, which we already face with AI that seems to be conscious. And so we have to, I think, really, this is why we have to clarify and make sure we're clear about highly uncertain, potentially long-term scenarios about AI actually being conscious, and present-day, here and now concerns about what AI does, playing on our anthropocentric biases.
We're worrying about violating the rights of AI when we're violating the rights of people by building AI. We're violating the rights of the privacy rights of everyone in the planet. Yeah.
Not to mention the intellectual property rights.
On morality. I mean, first of all, morality, although it can sometimes be construed academically as though it were a calculation, calculation is in some ways archetypally what morality isn't. That if you were the sort of person who made a calculus about whether it was worth doing a certain good act, that would be fundamentally immoral. So it can't be calculated, and whatever it has ideas of what is good or not are going to reflect the kind of views of somebody in Silicon Valley who put them in, and that person's views may be very different from ones we would wish a computer to have. And on self-replication, because that's come up, there's a difference between training a computer to generate the code to make another computer and so forth. But when an embryo develops, it's not, it becomes what it is in the process of being what it is. And in other words, there isn't a set of instructions. We now know that. There is not a set of instructions. And as the embryo develops, it doesn't develop with a heart and a liver and so on. It's a blob that differentiates within itself according to principles we don't entirely understand. That's quite different from anything that I believe that a computer can now do. Or will ever do.
We'll take questions in a second. So any point that you would like to add, or should we just go for it? I think we should...
Super quick. Just to finish the hypothesis, if it's true that algorithms cannot be moral agents for those reasons, it might be that for the same reasons they're not conscious. And so the hypothesis, which is kind of provocative and very much a hypothesis, is that at least some kinds of consciousness, some kinds of sophisticated consciousness, may be inherently moral.
Maybe.
Inherently moral. Hypothesis.
Let me just say one thing, which is that we don't know why transformer models work. Large language models, what we play with ChatGPT, we don't know why they work. We have invented something we don't understand. We have brought something into the world that we cannot control and we do not understand. We have invented something novel. All I'm saying in this conversation is, 200 years ago in London at some Royal Society meeting, people were talking about how disease works. They were talking about things, they're going, man, there's gotta be something here. And they didn't know about genes, they didn't know about viruses, they didn't know about antibiotics. They didn't know about relativity or quantum physics or any of this cool stuff we have today, and they certainly didn't have an internet. And all I'm saying is that we are touching something new in the universe that we don't fully understand, and like, I agree with every person on this panel, we should not be doing what we are doing, which is pumping all of our resources, all of our energy, all of our computation, all of our creativity, our best and brightest minds to go figure out how to make it bigger and make it global. And I'll just finish with this. We are not seeing a rising gen. What we are going to have is Gen AI. This is not generative AI. This is generation AI. We have a generation of people who have to deal with this. It's not going back in the bottle. Pandora's box ain't closing. And I fully agree we should have the ability to do something about it. I'm trying in my little day-to-day company to do something about it. We all are trying to find a way. But the question is, what is the story that we are going to tell that will help push this back and give us more time to do something about it? Because we can't reason about it. We don't know what it looks like. We don't know where this will be. And I don't think any of us feels confident that we have any idea what this will look like in a decade's time. So I wanted to say I fully agree with this conversation, and yet it's happening.
Thank you. So we have slightly less than half an hour now, so can you please keep your questions brief, and we'll try and keep the responses correspondingly brief if that works. So first question.
A 12-second question inspired by this utterly vital conversation. What moral choices are available to someone working on a technology they believe may have seriously destructive consequences for the world?
So open to whoever wants to respond to that.
So I often teach mathematicians and physicists and computer scientists, and I begin the class by talking about the regrets of other inventors and how you don't want to be this person. And so the stakes are very high and the bar is very high, but I try to get them to imagine that whatever they build is going to be taken over by someone with a lot of power who will try to misuse it, and they will have no control. And of course, in some cases, there's nothing you can do. But if you think like this from the start, from the design, you might have a chance to design it much better against abuse.
Can I give a 5-second response? You ask, what can we do? Resign your job and make sure you're an effective journalist. Put across your worries.
That's an interesting take, actually. As a journalist, I can sympathise with that. Question over here.
Thank you. This is purely a question and not an opinion. I'm curious what any of you, if you have a response or thoughts on how brain organoid tech being fused with computing, how that interacts with questions on consciousness and AI.
Yeah, thank you. I can take a first stab at that. Something I've thought about quite a bit, and I think it's almost the opposite end of the scale to a language model, right? Because brain organoids, for those of you, how many people know what brain organoids are? Some of you, not many. So a brain organoid is kind of a neurotechnology. Basically, biologists are now taking human embryonic stem cells, from skin or wherever, and putting them in some clever stuff, and they differentiate into brain cells. They differentiate into neurons, and if you culture them in the right way, they wire themselves up, and so you have organoids. You have what are sometimes called lab-grown mini-brains. They lack much of the structure, but they are collections of thousands, tens of thousands of neurons, sometimes more, that have brain-like aspects that are human brain cells. Now, I was on a panel at the National Academies a couple of years ago thinking about the ethics of these kinds of technologies from the perspective of consciousness, and the conclusion was like, nothing to worry about, these things are not going to be not conscious, not going to be conscious. But they lack exactly the kind of levers on our psychological biases that language models have. Back to my point, they may be more similar to us in ways that do matter and less similar in ways that don't. They are made out of the same stuff, so the whole uncertainty in philosophy about whether the stuff matters goes entirely away. So I'm much more worried about our potential for inaugurating synthetic consciousness in organoid farms at industrial scale than I am about GPT-5 and the light suddenly coming on. But the other thing is these technologies are being merged, right? There's a lab I visited in Melbourne, cortical labs that are doing these things. There was a terrible paper in Neuron that said it's sentient and then didn't actually use the term besides in the title, and then saying by sentient, we just mean it behaves, which was pretty shoddy. But it's now blurring the line between what is a computer and what is a living system. And it's a very open, unknown question how far you blur that line before you become sufficiently similar to a living brain in ways that make a difference.
I think that's part of my point, which is this is all in the category of artificial intelligence. Like, considering it to be computers writing code is inaccurate. We are not limited to silicon. And in fact, post-silicon computing is really a massive area of research, not just with brain-like organoids, but other things. So this all goes in the category of, oh shit.
Another one is like how we're using, like Neuralink and other companies are trying to get the chips and the computers inside our brain, right? So, and that's a huge privacy issue, among other things.
Some people think they're already there.
Carissa said, oh, that was a bit loud. Carissa said, what? Move it further away. Carissa said, this is not inevitable, we have a choice, but one might think without regulation, market forces are going to make certain things inevitable, are going to remove the choice. So I want to ask Carissa and Brian, as someone involved in the industry, do you think we need regulation to deal with this? And if so, what kind of regulation?
Absolutely, we need regulation. We need regulation on privacy. The kind of regulation we have is not good enough, not even in Europe. And to give an example with my students to the question that Rogan made, so if you have like two ways of designing a system, in one way you're collecting realms and realms of personal data, and in another you don't collect any personal data, then the second one is much safer because it's much harder to abuse. But we do need regulation. We need regulation on AI, and we've been talking about this with Charlie. There's so many things to do, and it's not like one thing that's going to be a panacea. But one thing that I think is absolutely necessary is to have agencies that are specialized, like the FDA, but with AI. We need randomized control trials. We need auditing of algorithms. And the tricky thing is that it's not only a one-time thing that you can just give the green light, like it is with a drug. You have to check that algorithm in the future because it can change a lot in how it behaves depending on the data. So I'll just give those two suggestions, but there's a list of like 10 or 15 things that we have to do at a minimum.
I'll just grab that one too, which I think also answers your question, Rogan, which is the thing that made nuclear the most obviously in need of regulation was was it 3 Mile Island in the US, where we almost had a nuclear catastrophe. And then all of a sudden we got really serious about regulation, but it didn't kill anybody. And what we actually need is the equivalent in the AI world. We need a disaster that's bad enough that it freaks us out, but not quite so bad that it destroys humanity. So we need to have like just the right size disaster, if that makes sense. And if you're thinking about Donald Trump's ear, that's not what I'm referring to. So we need that. And then we also need to think about what that regulation would look like in a pragmatic way. Because what we actually don't want is the end of nuclear power, if you think back to that, because it turns out that from an environmental perspective, it'd be really nice if we had a lot of nuclear reactors like France does, because they're actually much less bad for the environment and pollution and things like that. The consequences of regulation are often quite hard to predict. We're very early in this moment. So I think what we need is the equivalent of Mary Shelley. I don't think it's journalism that we need right now. I think it's fiction, science fiction, that scares us. It's a little bit of reality that scares us. And it's a new generation of politicians that is potentially not, I'm sorry, old folks, and maybe a generation that is living with and expecting to live with some of these technologies for decades, and is able to think ahead about what that world should look like.
Did you have a question? No, I've lost track. There was somebody around here who had a question then. Okay, so if...
Biological computing, is that what we're talking about?
Yeah.
Okay.
So, okay.
I want to ask a question about the seductive power about these machines, and it's been emphasized the language use, but isn't it, and I want to use the right adjective, isn't it the seeming capacity for general intelligence that's actually the most seductive feature? That they seem to have solved the silo problem that is generating a lot of this seductive danger?
I'm not sure that it is. I think language is particularly powerful, and there's been some empirical work on how people attribute consciousness to language models in virtue of the linguistic capability. Because maybe we're at a sort of time where we can identify that distinction, because certainly the first language models that made a splash were not considered to have solved general AI either. Yet they're still that was when people started attributing consciousness to them very readily. This idea of general AI being another threshold, I think, is just another reflection of our biases, which is maybe what you were saying. We bundle all these things together. Like, we associate consciousness with intelligence, and then human exceptionalism comes in when we think of implicitly the threshold at which the lights come on might be the point at which general AI is reached. But of course, that's not a point. As soon as you get there, AI is already more smarter than us in many ways. And so it's not really a thing anyway, that threshold. And you do not need to be smart in a general AI way to suffer. So I think it's part of the bias, but language is still somehow exhibits this unique seductive draw on our psychologies.
Yeah, I just want to pick up on the point made around writing code or models training themselves. Is there any indication that leads to a shift in the objective function, or in other words, an early sign of agency?
I would say that there has to be some sense of objective function in order to, the way we actually train models is that we effectively say this is right, and we train the model until it says what we want it to say. And I think that's the white guys in Silicon Valley bias. White guys are everywhere, so it's not just Silicon Valley. But the issue is, if the training data, in other words, the decision of what we're training toward, that objective function, is now being generated by AI, and the structure of the models, we actually ask the model, a different kind of model, what the best way to structure the model to achieve those goals is. We're really not very far from a world where that training data coming in and the structure of the model is effectively creating a new set of objective functions that we can't control. And that's largely the alignment problem of what happens if what the models want is different than what the humans want, if you will. And so there's a lot of questions around this, and a lot of the regulation conversation is about how do we stop that artificial threshold of general intelligence or these things diverging. I would say we're very close to a point where it's very easy to imagine that training data differs very greatly. And I think you made the point yesterday, Carissa, about everything on the internet always starts with porn. And if you're building a porn AI, then you actually have a lot of financial incentives not to be tied into a regulation system. We are terrible at regulating porn. Some places ban it, other places try to limit it. But fundamentally, we're seeing these places where transgression is the definition of the system. And so further transgression has very limited restriction if we can't talk about it. And so I'm just giving you an example of a domain, as always on the internet, where we're going to see these things go well beyond what we feel comfortable with. And then I'll also say that other empires like China are going to have similar areas where they are incentivized because of restrictions we're giving them to go past where we feel comfortable. So I would just say this I know I'm out of time, but this is the stuff where I get really nervous, is it's outside the area we talk about and feel comfortable in and can influence.
Just very quick follow-up. There are already machine learning algorithms which form their own objective functions under a very general objective function. Like the stuff we work on at Sussex, we have a very, single, very broad objective function, and then the algorithms basically choose what data to train on and to explore to build a generative model, and then part of that becomes a lower level objective function. So this is already happening. Whether that's agency is a very interesting question, because of course it depends on what you mean by agency. And I think there's an open question here about a system that has an objective function, a goal, broadly, given to it by a human designer. Does it really have agency, or is it just behaving in a way as if it has agency because we've given it a goal? Real agency might be something, again, that requires it having actual skin in the game.
Yeah, go.
So I wanted to ask any reflections in the context of secularism, and I'm thinking specifically of transhumanism and how it is sold. It's kind of a pseudo-religion sold in the narrative of progress of techno-scientific achievements, and how dangerous that may be for the future human, that we swallow that.
I mean, I think this is it's a different kind of psychological bias that's leading to these, I would say, delusions about conscious AI, which is this transhumanist desire to achieve immortality and upload oneself into the cloud and live forever. Then you get into motivated reasoning. People want consciousness to be something that can be preserved that way. And yeah, I mean, it's kind of a religious style set of beliefs that's filling a vacuum.
And it's interesting how many, this is not true for every computer scientist or every company, but there are some circles within Silicon Valley and similar circles that behave a lot like a religion. And actually, you've had very important people say things like, we're trying to create something akin to God.
Well, I mean, as it's been said before, these stories are ancient. I mean, there are myths of this, which is basically hubris, the desire for power beyond what is appropriate. And you may say, well, what do I mean by that? But I think if you understand what a human being is, and I think we understand less and less what a human being is, that's one of the problems with the way the culture's drifting, influenced by AI, amongst other things. If you do understand that, then you know that this is an ancient story and it will lead to destruction. And I think that the assault on the human, there are various kinds of it. One is the blending of a human with a machine, but another is actually the wish for immortality. Nature knows what it's doing, and life is not opposed by death, but as Goethe said, it is liberated by death. It is death that is the means whereby life makes more life. And the opposite of life is not death, it's the machine. That's where we're at.
I think another temptation is to think like, oh, technology is going to save us. We have this really big problem, but tech will save us. And so in particular, when it comes to climate change, there's so many people who say like, yes, AI is costing a lot, and it has this kind of horrible effects on democracy, but it's going to save us from climate change. And so I think it's really important to have people like Brian say like, well, that doesn't happen by magic. We actually have to measure these things and like design it, a plan, and kind of do it.
Just follow up on what Alex said. It's not just about beating death, transhumanism. It is about taking the logic of that which you don't control as inferior. Began with your talk, the whole issue of those who were colonized, the work I do with SEED, and basically beginning with assuming humans are inferior and need to be improved. And the only way they can improve is merge into the machine, which is that guy, the Descartes follower in Silicon Valley, what's his name? Kurzweil. So, I think part of the reason there's so much confusion on consciousness in the machine is because the man who defines the narrative is already talking about it as spiritual. Yeah? And I think the issue of narratives then becomes very, very important. You talked about machine learning versus artificial intelligence. And I'll talk more tomorrow, but I think a big piece, my life has been the time of a shift of technology from being tools of transformation to being the new religion. It's the only age where we talk about technology without definition. What did it use? What does it do? Nothing. Technology. Second is every time artificial is introduced, the impacts are not assessed. Artificial fertilizers. Okay, no one assessed. Yeah, so my question is, what are the externalities of machine learning become the basis of all of farming, all of food, all of cooking, given that it's hugely energy intensive and the amount of entropy it generates?
It's a great question. And it has such deep, resonant questions for us as a civilization. If you look at technology which hybridized winter wheat to, actually overcome rust and feed hundreds of millions of people. It's actually this contrast between the environmental movement saying don't mess with GMOs and genetic modification saving hundreds of millions of lives. I worry that if we say, could we use technology to allow more people to thrive on this planet, we would be very poor humanists to say, well, we shouldn't do that because we might use more energy or power. And I feel the same way about disease. To answer that question fully requires us to have just such deep fundamental wisdom about the choices we make with technology, the choices we make with our society. It requires something that we just lack in my mind, as a species right now, which is perspective, patience, wisdom, context, humility. I worry that answering your question in any way other than we should really get the best minds on the planet together to put some real thought into how we make these choices. That's why Wonderstruck is special to me, because we're all so different. We come from such different perspectives. If we could have insights on that, I can't wait for your talk tomorrow, by the way, because I want to hear your perspective on this, but I want to hear everyone's perspective on this, because I think we might just have ideas that we could all take back into what we do and maybe help make better choices.
Mine's a very nuts and boltsy question, which is, there's a sense of powerlessness in terms of it's happening, it's impossible to stop and all that sort of stuff. Who's got, which entities, which organizations, which people have got the best ideas? Where do you go and look for, if we're going to regulate this, or we're going to have a shot at regulating it, might be more accurate, where would you recommend going to?
Obviously, I'm biased, but I would say academics, and especially academics if they're financially independent from big tech. Because we are often publicly funded, and this is a bit of an idealized view, but there are lots of academics who care, who don't have a skin in the game in the sense that they're not going to become millionaires. Like at the moment, what governments are doing, they're inviting the tech bros to advise them. It's shocking. And these people are going to, are already kind of millionaires, or if not billionaires, and they have, they're going to earn more from it, and it's kind of shocking to see. And especially, I find it really kind of frustrating, and I'm not talking about myself. I'm talking about other women who have been researching this topic for decades, and they're being ignored in favor of the tech bro who just wrote a successful book because he got a big advance. So that would be my advice.
I'd echo that, and of course I'd include Carissa in that list of people who really can give the best advice on this too. But there are a couple of other organizations. There's an organization called the Center for Humane Technologies, which I think is pretty good at giving this kind of advice. There's the Institute for AI Safety, which is quite there. There are numbers, but one has to be careful about where their support comes from. I think those two are pretty good. But yeah, there was a contrast when we asked at the beginning who thinks AI can be conscious. Nobody raised their hand. When I go to machine learning meetings, everyone raises their hand. They think it's completely obvious, and that's a real problem. So it's also going to academics who just don't make that assumption. Academics from tangential perspectives, philosophers, lawyers, and neuroscientists, because they have the best idea about how brains do stuff and what the relevant differences might be.
And I'm going to jump in since I've still got the mic and Nigel hasn't stopped me. So Brian, what do you think? Oh, sorry, please.
No, you carry on. I mean, all I was going to say was, I think there's dangers in being over-optimistic about regulation because there is a prisoner's dilemma. And what we don't do, the Chinese will do, as it were. And so if that's going to happen, then we need to be in that game as well. That's the way this is going to work. And therefore, regulation will be relatively toothless.
So, sure. So, Brian, I don't mean to nitpick. I've really enjoyed this. But you said earlier, I believe, what a machine wants may be different than what we want in reference to generating its own objective function. Do you believe that a machine that we know to be hallucinatory and throwing spaghetti at the wall can have wants? Like, is that the proper word to use? Or for something that is a positive feedback loop in this sense?
Sorry, did you say that humans who are hallucinatory and throw spaghetti against the wall can't have wants? I mean, we are really hallucinatory. Like, we don't even know what reality is. We are extremely poor as agents, I think. And I think that's biological. I think that's deeply embedded in our history of escaping the jungle and those rustling bushes. We're anxious, we're confused, we're hungry, we're horny. All of these things are fundamentally human. The hallucinatory part doesn't bother me in the slightest. The part that bothers me about where we are is that we don't know how they work. We don't know what they do. We don't know why they hallucinate fully. And so we're actually dealing with something deeply unknown and deeply novel that we can't reason about yet. And so if you're a psychologist, you can categorize a zillion different ways that people are messed up and have problems. And you can send them to therapy and do all kinds of things. What's the therapist for a machine look like? We don't know yet. And I'm very nervous that we need a lot more work and foundation before we can answer that question.
I think you hit the nail on the head. It's the difference between a machine really wanting something and behaving as if looking like it wants something really turns on whether the machine feels anything. To want something is to have an experience of liking, wanting, feeling, needing. Right? And that's the question at issue. If we don't distinguish these things, we will make a lot of mistakes. And the language we use matters greatly as well. Lots of people talk about language models hallucinating when they make shit up. They do not hallucinate. Hallucination, when we use that word, it immediately brings connotations of a perceptual experience, seeing something that's not there. And that's just part of that careless use of language just amplifies our anthropomorphic projections. If we're going to say anything when a language model makes stuff up, we should say it confabulates. Exactly. That's what we do as human beings when we say stuff that's not true without even knowing what we're doing. But we don't use that word, and I think one practical thing we can do, going to be very hard, if we get the language right, we can think better.
Thank you.
Here.
Thank you very much. So thank you for a brilliant panel discussion. And And superb questions. Thank you very much.